Ladies and gentlemen, today we journey back to a time when the United States was not yet the vast, unified nation we know today, but a patchwork of untamed lands, wild opportunities, and rugged ambition. This is the story of the American frontier, a defining chapter in the nation's history that shaped not just a country, but a culture, a mindset, and a myth. The origins of the American frontier trace back to the early 17th century, long before the idea of the Wild West was even imagined. This period marked the beginning of European colonization in North America, starting predominantly with the English, Spanish, and French establishing settlements along the eastern seaboard and in parts of the interior. In 1607, the English founded Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Just 13 years later, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the 13 British colonies. But these settlements were not isolated endeavors. They were the initial stepping stones in a long and continuous push westward, a movement fueled by the search for land, wealth, freedom, and religious opportunity. The idea of the frontier in this early phase was not yet the vast plains or deserts of the American West. Instead, it referred to the dense, mysterious forests that bordered colonial towns, stretching out into the unknown interior. Every few miles westward brought settlers into new, unfamiliar territory where they encountered new challenges, both environmental and human. For the Native American tribes who had inhabited the continent for thousands of years, this encroachment was a direct threat to their way of life. These early frontier regions became zones of cultural collision and frequent conflict. Treaties were made and broken, alliances shifted, and violence flared as colonists moved into lands previously controlled by indigenous nations. The French, for their part, established trading networks deep into the interior along the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes, competing with the British for control of land and influence over native tribes. The Spanish colonized much of the Southwest and Florida, introducing missions and military outposts. Each of these powers laid down roots in different parts of the continent, creating overlapping zones of influence that would later become battlegrounds for imperial, colonial, and tribal conflicts. This first phase of the frontier was more than just geographical movement. It was the beginning of a long, complex transformation of the continent. It set the stage for centuries of expansion, innovation, and struggle, shaping the foundation of what the United States would eventually become. By the early 19th century, as the United States began to solidify its identity as a young and ambitious republic, a powerful and deeply influential ideology began to take hold of the American imagination. This was manifest destiny, a term coined in 1845 by journalist John L. O'Sullivan, who declared it was the nation's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence. Though the phrase itself was new, the belief behind it had been growing for decades. At its core, manifest destiny was the conviction that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, and eventually across all of North America. Manifest destiny was more than just a justification for territorial expansion. It was a cultural force. It combined elements of nationalism, religious fervor, and economic ambition into a potent belief system that shaped policies, influenced public opinion, and drove millions of Americans to move westward. It painted expansion not as a conquest, but as a noble mission, one that brought civilization, democracy, and progress to the so-called wilderness. This belief had both ideological and practical implications. It encouraged the annexation of vast territories such as Texas in 1845, the Oregon Territory in 1846, and the vast southwestern lands acquired after the Mexican-American War through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. These acquisitions added millions of square miles to the U.S. map and dramatically changed the nation's demographics, economy, and geopolitics. However, manifest destiny also carried darker consequences. It was often used to justify the displacement and mistreatment of Native American tribes, the expansion of slavery into new territories, and military aggression against neighboring countries. Indigenous nations were frequently seen as obstacles to progress rather than sovereign peoples, and the expansion driven by manifest destiny often came at the cost of their land, cultures, and lives. The belief also intensified sectional tensions within the United States itself, as debates raged over whether new territories should allow slavery. These conflicts eventually contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War. Despite its controversies, manifest destiny remained a defining idea in American politics and culture for much of the 19th century, shaping not just physical expansion, but the very identity of the country and its role in the world. One of the most iconic moments in the history of the American frontier was the epic journey of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, who led the Corps of Discovery from 1804 to 1806. This expedition was launched shortly after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, a monumental land deal in which the United States, under President Thomas Jefferson, acquired approximately 828,000 square miles of territory from France, effectively doubling the size of the young nation. Yet, despite the vast scale of this acquisition, much of the newly acquired land remained a mystery to the U.S. government. President Jefferson, a curious and forward-thinking statesman, believed it was vital to explore this uncharted land to understand its geography, resources, native peoples, and potential for settlement. He commissioned his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and Lewis's chosen partner, William Clark, to lead a military-style expedition to explore the territory west of the Mississippi River, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The journey began in May 1804 near St. Louis, Missouri, and stretched over 8,000 miles round-trip. The Corps of Discovery, consisting of about 40 men, traveled by keelboat, canoe, and on foot across rugged terrain, treacherous rivers, and towering mountain ranges. Along the way, they meticulously documented hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to science and created detailed maps of the region, maps that would become crucial for future settlers, traders, and government planners. One of the most pivotal moments of the expedition was the inclusion of Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who joined the expedition as a guide and interpreter. Her knowledge of the terrain and ability to communicate with various Native American tribes proved invaluable to the success of the mission. Her presence also signaled to many tribes that the group was not a war party, which helped reduce hostilities in certain areas. The Lewis and Clark expedition was not just an exploration mission, it was also an early act of diplomacy. The explorers encountered dozens of Native American tribes, offering them peace medals, flags, and other tokens of friendship on behalf of the U.S. government. They also collected ethnographic data on these groups, noting their customs, languages, and political structures. However, these interactions were complex and often strained. While some tribes welcomed the explorers, others viewed them with suspicion, aware that this reconnaissance might signal future encroachment on their lands. By the time the Corps of Discovery returned to St. Louis in September 1806, they had not only fulfilled Jefferson's vision, but had also ignited the imagination of a generation of Americans. The detailed journals kept by Lewis and Clark were published and widely read, fueling public fascination with the Western territories and encouraging the next wave of pioneers to head westward in search of opportunity and adventure. The expansion of the American frontier had perhaps no greater and more tragic impact than on the Native American tribes who had lived on the land for thousands of years. Long before European settlers arrived, North America was a richly diverse continent inhabited by hundreds of indigenous nations, each with their own cultures, languages, religions, economies, and systems of governance. These communities had complex relationships with one another, as well as deep spiritual connections to the land that sustained them. But with the onset of colonization and, later, the aggressive push westward, their world would be forever transformed. At first, encounters between Native Americans and European settlers involved a mix of trade, cooperation, and conflict. Indigenous tribes helped early colonists survive harsh winters, taught them how to cultivate local crops, and engaged in fur trading that enriched both parties. However, as settler populations grew and territorial hunger intensified, the dynamics rapidly shifted. Treaties were signed, often under duress or through manipulation, ceding vast tracts of tribal land to colonial and federal governments. These agreements were frequently broken or renegotiated to the detriment of Native peoples. As the frontier moved westward, Native Americans were increasingly pushed from their ancestral lands. Forced relocations, such as the infamous Trail of Tears in the 1830s, led to the displacement of tens of thousands of indigenous people from the southeastern United States to remote and unfamiliar territories west of the Mississippi River. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exhaustion during these brutal journeys, which were justified under the Indian Removal Act signed by President Andrew Jackson. Moreover, the cultural impact was equally devastating. As settlers flooded into new territories, they brought with them not only new laws and customs, but also diseases like smallpox and measles, to which native populations had no immunity. Entire communities were wiped out by epidemics. Meanwhile, missionary efforts attempted to convert indigenous people to Christianity and suppress traditional beliefs, ceremonies, and languages, leading to the erosion of cultural identities. The U.S. government established a reservation system, confining tribes to specific areas that were often barren, remote, and unsuitable for agriculture or hunting. Promises of food, education, and supplies were rarely fulfilled adequately, and many reservations suffered from extreme poverty and neglect. At the same time, native resistance movements, such as those led by leaders like Tecumseh, Sitting Bull, and Geronimo, fought to defend their homelands and sovereignty, but these efforts were largely crushed by military force. In the eyes of the U.S. government and many settlers, Native Americans were seen as obstacles to progress, barriers to be removed or assimilated. This mindset led to numerous violent clashes, including massacres and full-scale wars, and laid the groundwork for long-standing marginalization and trauma within indigenous communities. The Indian Wars refer to a long and complex series of conflicts between Native American tribes and European American settlers and the United States government. These wars spanned more than 2 centuries, from the early colonial period in the 1600s to the end of the 19th century. While each conflict had its own causes, geography, and outcomes, they were all part of a broader struggle over land, sovereignty, and survival as the frontiers steadily advanced westward. In the early years, during colonial times, many of the conflicts were localized and involved disputes over land ownership and trade routes. Wars such as King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, in New England and the Powhatan Wars in Virginia were some of the earliest examples of violent resistance by native tribes against English colonists. These early wars often involved brutal tactics on both sides and resulted in significant losses for native communities, both in terms of life and land. As the United States emerged after the Revolutionary War and began pushing westward, the scope and intensity of the Indian Wars grew. The U.S. government and settlers viewed the western lands as empty and ripe for cultivation, disregarding the fact that they were home to millions of indigenous people. With each new territory added, often through purchases, treaties, or military conquest, native tribes were pressured, coerced, or forced to relocate. The 19th century saw the Indian Wars escalate to a national level. During this time, the U.S. Army became deeply involved in campaigns to subdue native resistance, especially in regions like the Great Plains, the Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest. These were not isolated battles, but organized military campaigns, often lasting years and involving thousands of soldiers and civilians. Tribes such as the Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, Comanche, and Nez Perce fiercely defended their territories, cultures, and way of life. Some of the most well-known confrontations include the Dakota War of 1862, the Sand Creek Massacre, 1864, and the Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876, where General Custer and his forces were famously defeated by a coalition of native tribes led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Despite such victories, the overwhelming force of the U.S. military and continued waves of settlers eventually wore down indigenous resistance. The Indian Wars were not just military events. They were also marked by psychological and cultural warfare. U.S. policies deliberately sought to break tribal unity, outlaw indigenous ceremonies, destroy food sources such as the bison, and remove children from their families to be placed in boarding schools designed to strip away their native identity. These tactics were aimed at both physical and cultural domination, leaving a legacy of trauma that persists in many native communities to this day. By the late 1800s, resistance had largely been crushed. One of the final symbolic events of the Indian Wars was the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, where U.S. troops killed over 250 Lakota men, women, and children, many of them unarmed, on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. This massacre marked a turning point and is often seen as the tragic conclusion of the Indian Wars era. When one imagines the American frontier, few images are as iconic or enduring as that of the cowboy, clad in boots and a wide-brimmed hat, riding across open plains, lasso in hand. The cowboy is a symbol that has come to represent rugged independence, freedom, and the adventurous spirit of the American West. Yet behind the myth and Hollywood glamour lies a complex and deeply rooted historical reality. The cowboy was not just a gunslinging hero of legend. He was a laborer, a rancher, a trailblazer, and in many cases, a cultural bridge between worlds. The role of the cowboy emerged primarily in the post-Civil War era, during the massive cattle boom that transformed the economy of the western United States. After the war, demand for beef skyrocketed in the northern states, and vast open ranges in Texas, New Mexico, Kansas, and other frontier regions provided the perfect conditions for cattle to be raised and herded. Cowboys were hired to manage these massive herds, guide them along treacherous cattle drives, and protect them from rustlers, predators, and stampedes. One of the most famous aspects of cowboy life was the long cattle drive, grueling journeys that could span hundreds of miles as herds were moved from remote ranches to railway hubs like Dodge City or Abilene, where they would be shipped east. These drives lasted for weeks or even months, requiring incredible endurance and teamwork. Cowboys worked sunup to sundown, enduring heat, cold, dust storms, and isolation. Nights were spent under the stars, with little shelter and even less comfort. Despite the image of the solitary cowboy, most worked in crews under trail bosses, with clearly defined roles such as wranglers, cooks, and flank riders. Life on the trail demanded discipline, trust, and cooperation. And while the cowboy is often portrayed as white in popular media, in reality, cowboys came from diverse backgrounds. An estimated 1 in 4 cowboys was black, many of whom were formerly enslaved individuals seeking new lives in the West. There were also significant numbers of Mexican vaqueros, skilled horsemen, and cattle herders whose techniques and tools, such as lassos, spurs, and saddles, greatly influenced cowboy culture. Native Americans, and even some women also worked as cowhands, though often overlooked in historical narratives. The cowboy was more than just a worker. He became a symbol of a vanishing way of life. As the open range began to close with the arrival of barbed wire, railroads, and expanding settlements, the free-roaming cowboy lifestyle began to fade. But the romantic idea of the cowboy lived on, especially through dime novels, Wild West shows like those of Buffalo Bill Cody, and eventually Hollywood films that turned them into larger-than-life heroes. In truth, cowboy life was harsh, demanding, and far more nuanced than the legends suggest. It was a lifestyle that required bravery, resilience, and a deep familiarity with nature and livestock. Cowboys helped shape the economic foundation of the frontier, contributed to its cultural fabric, and became a powerful national symbol, even as the real lives they led were far more grounded in hardship and grit than glory. One of the most transformative events in the history of the American frontier was the passing of the Homestead Act in 1862, a piece of legislation that played a pivotal role in accelerating westward expansion and reshaping the social and economic landscape of the United States. Signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln during the height of the Civil War, the act was designed to promote settlement of the vast Western territories and to offer ordinary citizens the opportunity to own land and build new lives. But its effects rippled far beyond mere real estate. It would become a central element of the American dream, offering land, freedom, and hope to millions, while simultaneously deepening the displacement of native populations. Under the provisions of the Homestead Act, any U.S. citizen or intended citizen who had never taken up arms against the U.S. government could claim 160 acres of public land. To gain ownership, they were required to live on the land, build a dwelling, and cultivate it for 5 continuous years. Alternatively, they could purchase the land after 6 months of residency for a small fee. This seemingly simple arrangement sparked a mass migration of settlers, farmers, former slaves, immigrants, single women, Civil War veterans, and families of all backgrounds toward the American West, eager to carve out a future on the frontier. The appeal of the Homestead Act was profound. For the poor, landless, and ambitious, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire property and escape crowded, industrialized cities. For recently freed African Americans, it represented a chance to build independence and autonomy after slavery. For immigrants arriving from Europe, it offered a fresh start in a land full of promise. More than 4 million claims were made under the Homestead Act over the following decades, resulting in the transfer of over 270 million acres of land into private hands, roughly 10% of the total land area of the United States. However, the promise of free land came with enormous challenges. Homesteaders faced a harsh and unforgiving environment. Many settled in regions with extreme weather, limited rainfall, and few trees. They had to construct homes out of sod, plow tough prairie soils, and endure threats ranging from droughts and locust swarms to isolation and illness. Medical care was scarce, neighbors were often miles apart, and survival required grit, innovation, and relentless hard work. The expansion also came at a steep human cost. The very lands being offered to settlers were often ancestral homelands of Native American tribes. As homesteaders pushed westward, they directly contributed to the displacement of indigenous peoples, the destruction of tribal hunting grounds, and the erosion of native cultures. Clashes between settlers and native tribes became more frequent and violent, further intensifying the Indian Wars and prompting the government to impose harsher military and legal measures to contain resistance. Moreover, not all settlers succeeded. Many homesteaders, despite their best efforts, failed to meet the conditions of the act due to poor soil, weather extremes, or financial hardship. Some abandoned their claims, while others sold them to speculators and large corporations, leading to the consolidation of land and growing inequality. Despite these drawbacks, the Homestead Act remains one of the most significant and ambitious social experiments in American history. It fueled the mythos of the self-reliant pioneer, laid the groundwork for the agricultural development of the Great Plains and Midwest, and deeply influenced the nation's sense of identity, rooted in the belief that hard work, determination, and courage could tame even the wildest frontiers. Few events in American frontier history captured the imagination and spirit of adventure quite like the gold rushes that erupted throughout the 19th century. These sudden discoveries of gold, and later silver and other precious minerals, set off waves of migration, forever transforming the economic, social, and geographic makeup of the American West. The most famous of these was the California Gold Rush of 1848 to 1855, but it was far from the only one. Similar rushes followed in Colorado, 1859, Nevada, Comstock Lode, 1859, Montana, the Black Hills of South Dakota, 1874, and Alaska, Klondike Gold Rush, 1896 to 1899. Together, these frenzied pursuits of wealth became key engines of frontier expansion and development. The California Gold Rush began in earnest in January 1848, when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near Coloma, California. Within months, word of the discovery spread like wildfire, and by 1849, tens of thousands of prospectors, nicknamed 49ers, poured into the region from across the United States and around the world. People from Latin America, Europe, China, and Australia arrived by ship and wagon, dreaming of striking it rich. What had been a sleepy Mexican province rapidly transformed into a booming territory, and by 1850, California was admitted to the Union as a state. The economic ripple effects were enormous. Entire towns sprang up overnight near mining sites. Places like San Francisco, which grew from a tiny village into a major port city almost overnight. Businesses catering to miners, hotels, saloons, general stores, and banks flourished. While some individuals did indeed find fortunes in gold, many more found stable income through supporting industries like toolmaking, transportation, and food supply. The gold rush economy wasn't just about precious metals. It was about commerce, entrepreneurship, and opportunity. Mining itself was grueling and often dangerous work. Early methods involved simple panning and sluicing in riverbeds, but as surface gold became scarce, more sophisticated and industrial-scale methods were developed. Hydraulic mining, for example, used high-pressure water to erode entire hillsides, leaving devastating environmental scars. The labor was intense, and living conditions in mining camps were often crude, lawless, and filled with disease, violence, and hardship. Beyond the economic boost, the gold rushes had lasting effects on the infrastructure of the frontier. Roads, bridges, and later railroads were built to support the movement of people and goods. Telegraph lines stretched into previously isolated areas. Banks and financial institutions emerged to handle the growing flow of wealth, laying the groundwork for regional and national financial systems. However, the promise of gold also brought exploitation, exclusion, and conflict. Native American lands were invaded and seized as mining operations expanded. Entire communities were uprooted or destroyed. Racial tensions ran high, particularly against Chinese laborers who faced harsh discrimination and violence, despite playing a major role in both mining and railroad construction. Laws like the foreign miners' tax were imposed to push out non-white competitors, reinforcing a system that often favored white settlers and businessmen. Despite these dark aspects, the gold rushes reshaped America's perception of the West. The idea that anyone, regardless of background, could strike it rich by sheer determination became a powerful narrative that fed into the national ethos. The dream of the West as a land of endless opportunity was solidified, even though the reality was far more complex, uneven, and often unforgiving. Few developments had a more profound and lasting impact on the American frontier than the construction and expansion of the railroads. These iron arteries did more than just carry passengers and freight. They redefined the geography, economy, and even the culture of the West. Before the advent of the railroad, journeys across the frontier were perilous, long, and uncertain, often taking months by wagon or on foot across rough terrain. The arrival of the railroads, particularly the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, collapsed time and distance, stitching together the East and West into a unified, dynamic whole. The Transcontinental Railroad was a monumental engineering and logistical feat stretching from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California, and joined at Promontory Summit, Utah. This line symbolized the triumph of industry and human will over nature. Built by two companies, the Union Pacific building westward and the Central Pacific building eastward, it took thousands of laborers to complete the task, including a significant number of Chinese immigrants on the Central Pacific side and Irish workers on the Union Pacific. These workers endured brutal conditions, freezing winters, scorching summers, dangerous rock blasts, disease, and the constant threat of native attacks in contested areas. With the completion of the railroads, a new era of frontier life began. Settlers could now travel westward in relative comfort and speed, bringing families, furniture, livestock, and dreams of a new life. Supplies and manufactured goods flowed back and forth more efficiently than ever before. Towns and cities sprang up almost overnight along the tracks, often beginning as simple stations or supply depots and evolving into bustling hubs of commerce and culture. Economically, the railroads revolutionized the West. Cattle from Texas could now be transported quickly to slaughterhouses in Chicago. Farmers on the Great Plains could ship their wheat and corn to markets in New York or Boston. Mining companies could move heavy machinery and ore with unprecedented ease. Timber, minerals, and crops were extracted and moved across the country, fueling both Western growth and national industrial expansion. In essence, the railroads turned the vast and often isolated frontier into an integrated part of the American economy. The railroads also played a major role in land ownership and development. The U.S. government incentivized railroad construction by granting massive tracts of land, over 180 million acres, to railroad companies. These companies sold portions of this land to settlers, creating additional streams of revenue while encouraging population growth. This resulted in a patchwork of private landholdings crisscrossing native lands, accelerating the displacement of indigenous peoples and further encroaching on tribal sovereignty. Culturally, the railroads brought change as well. Newspapers, mail, books, and new ideas flowed westward, linking distant communities to the pulse of the rest of the country. At the same time, railroads enabled the expansion of tourism. Iconic destinations like the Rocky Mountains, Yellowstone, and the Grand Canyon became accessible to middle-class travelers, beginning the West's transformation from a place of survival and labor to one of exploration and leisure. But the railroads were not without controversy or consequence. The rapid expansion came with widespread corruption, most notably seen in scandals like the Credit Mobilier affair, where government officials and businessmen profited at the public's expense. Moreover, the environmental impact was severe. Rail construction cut through forests, rivers, and mountains, leaving ecological scars. And for Native American tribes, the railroads represented a death knell for their traditional ways of life, slicing through hunting grounds, introducing foreign settlers, and symbolizing a force of unstoppable change. By the late 19th century, the American frontier, once an untamed wilderness full of potential and promise, had undergone dramatic changes, leading to the symbolic closing of the frontier. The 1890 census marked a crucial point in American history when the U.S. government officially declared the frontier closed. This declaration was made based on the fact that there was no longer a discernible line of unsettled land. Most of the western territories had been fully explored, mapped, and populated. The wild expanses that had once been the hallmark of the American frontier were now dominated by farms, railroads, towns, and cities. The closing of the frontier was not just a geographical shift. It marked the end of an era, the conclusion of an American mythos, and the beginning of a new phase in the country's development. At the heart of this transformation was the relentless push westward by settlers, miners, ranchers, and railroads. The vast tracts of land that had once been the domain of Native American tribes and wild animals were now parceled into states, towns, and farms. By 1890, much of the western United States had been fully incorporated into the Union, including the final territories of Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho, marking the formal end of frontier expansion. The government's declaration that the frontier was closed was, in part, a recognition that much of the wilderness had been tamed, often through violent means. The indigenous peoples who had once roamed freely across the plains, mountains, and deserts had been forced onto reservations, their cultures undermined, their populations decimated. Native American tribes that had fiercely resisted expansion, like the Lakota Sioux, Apache, and Cheyenne, had been defeated in bloody confrontations such as the Battle of Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee, which marked the tragic end of major Native resistance. The closing of the frontier was also a recognition of the changing nature of the American economy and society. The frontier had once been a place of opportunity, where settlers could claim land and start anew. Now, with the frontier closed, the U.S. economy was shifting toward industrialization, with factories, railroads, and urban centers becoming the focal points of American life. The agricultural lifestyle that had defined much of the frontier experience was increasingly being replaced by wage labor in factories and mines. The idea of the frontier, however, didn't disappear. It transformed into a symbol of American individualism, ruggedness, and expansionism. The frontier spirit became deeply ingrained in the national consciousness, symbolized by figures such as Buffalo Bill Cody, whose Wild West shows romanticized the adventures of the American West, and Frederick Jackson Turner, whose 1893 frontier thesis argued that the existence of the frontier had shaped American democracy and the American character. Turner's thesis suggested that the frontier experience had forged the uniquely American traits of self-reliance, egalitarianism, and innovation. In many ways, the closing of the frontier did not signify an end to the spirit of expansion. Rather, it marked a new chapter. While the frontier itself was no longer a physical reality, the notion of pushing beyond established boundaries would continue to play a central role in American life, particularly in the fields of exploration, overseas imperialism, and the exploration of space in the 20th century. The closing of the frontier also led to a heightened interest in preserving what remained of the natural landscapes of the West, giving rise to the national parks movement and the eventual creation of places like Yellowstone National Park in 1872, the first of its kind in the world.